key performance indicators to measure success presentation. This session is for executive managers and security teams who want to know the effectiveness and performance of their organization's application security initiatives. We're going to look at some management excellence principles and concerns, why the need for AppSec and DevSecOps metrics, then look at some of the beginning metrics that can be used, and lastly, next steps, takeaways, where to start. So if we look at management excellence principles overall, we have some different platitudes. You can't get anywhere if you don't know where you are. If you can't be measured, can't be managed. If KPIs aren't managed and monitored, then maybe the efforts shouldn't be funded. So from a management concern, what are the things that they would want to know and need to know? So the first one is, how does the performance of our security practice compare with other organizations? And truthfully, how good or bad is the security quality of our applications in production and also in our development pipeline right now? Is the security quality of our applications getting better, or is it getting worse? And what really needs to be addressed and fixed as soon as possible, or could follow on thereafter? We also need to know what we don't know. So what are we not actively monitoring and managing that we should, and we really need to know? And then as well, are we paying enough attention to our production deployed applications to ensure that they are adequately hardened from malicious attacks and unintended data set security to the best of our ability? And what isn't as effective as we thought it would, and why is that? And finally, what should we do more of that's being effective and we are getting good results? What maybe do less of? Maybe we're having the results that we want to achieve, and so we don't need to focus as much in those areas. Or which efforts are not bearing the ROI and the business value that we thought they would, that we should stop or reevaluate. So looking at the why from application security overall and metrics from a couple different sources here, we have managers, software development teams, DevOps, and information security teams. And there are a lot of claims made about application security and applying security in the software development pipeline, the CI/CD pipelines, which is DevSecOps. But does anybody really know and really feel that those initiatives are delivering business value overall? So from an executive management perspective, the type of questions that they're looking to have answered are, what is the organization's currently accepted financial risk exposure from a malicious attack or unintended sensitive information disclosure? Also, what is the confidence that the security performance of all of our applications is being monitored? So what percentage is maybe unknown because we haven't identified it, we're not monitoring or quantifying it? What applications and components are not being actively managed? Is our security risk improving or getting worse? So what are the current vulnerabilities that we have and exploits that could be exploited in production? But also, what are the new ones that are being introduced through new applications and updates being deployed into our production environment? Are our security investments cost effective in delivering business value as was forecasted? So are they truly reducing cost? Are we improving the productivity or the velocity? Improving security quality overall and reducing the security risk? From the team's perspectives, then we have the software development team that wants and needs to know as well what their tech debt is from production vulnerable exploits or could be exploited for their own applications and their components. And what is the release quality, security quality of that team's release for each production release? For the DevOps team as well, looking at the tools and the processes they've put into place, are those improving or worsening the situation? So looking at things like security attack risks, the release velocity, and the cost. Information security teams need to know as well what the return on investments and the key performance indicators are that are required for the security quality control processes and initiatives that they want to initiate and manage. So this includes not only the implementation costs, but the ongoing annualized management and maintenance and support for those. So these metrics that we'll talk about here are specific to applications that are developed in-house by in-house programmers. We're not talking about software applications that are purchased and then configured and deployed or used. So those are commercial off-the-shelf COTS type applications. We're not talking about those. But here are some of the following starting baseline metrics that can be used for executives and the management of the software development teams. And these really should be reviewed monthly to look at them from a perspective of the financial risk that's being accepted, continuous improvement opportunities and initiatives, sponsoring the different security initiatives, prioritizing them, and also the amount of investment that needs to be applied. So we're going to talk about production security quality and the business financial risk exposure. And we'll talk about metrics for the secure software development life cycle. What's the organization's maturity level and performance? Looking at the application security quality testing tools and methods. Then we have metrics for application security consulting within the organization, training, and also for the DevSecOps practices as well. So in the first category here of production security quality and the business financial risk exposure, what is the primary source of data for that? And we have there a couple different areas. You have your compliance for those who are regulatory audited, internal or external, and also in reference to your own security best practices as an organization. So the audits of those processes. Then you also have your penetration testing team looking for security vulnerabilities, both internal to the organization and maybe external entities as well. And then you may have a bug bounty program or independent issues that are reported that are submitted to your organization as well. So the kinds of metrics that we want here are a percentage of the releases with penetration tests. So you have maybe 1,000 different production releases. So how many of those had a penetration test? And maybe you want to be more explicit and talk about whether or not a full penetration test was done, or did you mean that a penetration tester just went in and did maybe a quick sanity check, spent maybe an hour or something like that and wrote up something. So there's a difference in the types, but the main one that we want to capture is a full penetration where they tried to find any type of vulnerability. We also then want to look at, well, what are the number of vulnerabilities that were detected and found, along with the different types of categories, so that we can filter them by those different types, such as, say, injection vulnerability or cross-site scripting, along with the severity. So is it a high, medium, or low exploitability? And then we want to create from that then the financial value of the insecurity tech debt. So this is the cost that it would take to remediate each one of those. So if we have, say, an issue, then what's the average cost to the organization to go and fix that particular issue? So this is something that you can look at, grab a number with some initial analysis on what that costs versus, actually the next one here is talking about the avoidance. So there's the one about just to remediate it, but then you also want to look at your cost avoidance. In other words, in your secure software development lifecycle, if that issue had been detected earlier, such as through a code review or in security requirements, then how much money would have been saved as a result of that? So you want to shift left back to when the coding was done in the first place. What would that cost delta have been? So that was a lost opportunity for the secure software development that wasn't applied. And then what's the financial risk exposure to the organization as a whole, which would also take into account things like lost customer business, financial legal regress, so lawsuits, compliance fines, things like that. So the organization's governance risk and compliance department would be able to calculate those as an average for the application. And then what you want to do is review that on a quarterly type basis. The application will change over time as well as the security controls. So the amount and the risk that's seen out there and the type of exploits that are out there could vary that number. So you want to make sure you review those quarterly and have them available. So any type of penetration testing, what you should look for in that is that that's an indication that your security requirements that you have for the organization and your applications wasn't specific enough for the developers. So they didn't understand how they could have avoided it in the first place and included that in their original designs in their development process. The other part of that is the secure software development process overall. So that would have had a number of tests that should have identified any vulnerabilities prior to them being released. So you're looking for those. Now, for the categorization of these vulnerabilities that you find, one tempting way to do it would be according to the OWASP Top 10, the Open Web Application Security Project. It's a great way to do it. However, you have to realize that that survey report is done every few years. And as a result, those categories can change, which means that when you're looking at your data across time, you'll find that the categories don't align. So instead, a very effective way to do that is to use the MITRE common weakness enumeration terminology taxonomy. And those then also have a mapping into the OWASP Top 10. So you can still get that information, as well as the fact that the Top 10 doesn't address all the different types of vulnerabilities. So they do like the 80-20 rule, the Pareto type rule. What are the most common that they can fit into 10 categories that will take care of most of the issues. But you will find additional vulnerabilities in your security testing that are outside of those parameters. And so you can capture those more effectively if you use CWE as the categorization. And also an important aspect is that you notice in here that we're talking about the production release of these particular vulnerabilities. We do not want to count in here in these numbers for the financial risk any kind of vulnerability bug that's found before the software is released. So you can find it in your QA environment or whatever, but that still gives the development team the opportunity to remediate that before it is pushed into production using production data, and that's where the real exposure is. So if you look at, well, okay, we have a process, we have requirements, how effective are those? Those are those metrics before. Then how well is our secure software development process working? So each organization will have a different definition about what their SSDLC is. Some of the key elements that you would have in there are things like the design threat assessments, the dynamic application security testing tools that are used, so dynamic and static code analysis. You have the security code review processes, your manual inspection, so testing by security teams for their acceptance, or your production penetration tests. So each one of those are components in your SSDLC. Which one of those are being done within your organization and for your teams, your products, and your releases? Data sources of where you can find this information are in your project management ticketing systems. So an example of that is, say, Jira Tasks, if you're using that. Also, you want to look at your automated build and deploy orchestration system, your CI/CD orchestration, like Jenkins. So with that, you're going to look at, well, how frequently were these things done for a particular product and releases. And in there, you can assign a number to those for your maturity. And a good reference point to use for that is the OWASP SAM project, which is the Software Assurance Maturity Matrix. And in that framework, you take that and adjust it and look at the criteria for it and probably come up with your own level that you want to measure. So some suggested levels maybe as you use 0 through 3. 0 meaning that there was no SSDLC task or any evidence of that being done. So maybe somebody says that they did it, but if it's not in the ticketing system or it's not in your logs, then you have no evidence for it. So that would be none or non-compliant. Maybe low, you want to identify teams that have started and at least they're using one or more of the testing tools. Then you can have a partial, which is maybe add a couple more of those elements, versus say level 3, you would have being full compliant, right? So everything defined in your secure software development lifecycle process was done for a particular release. We mentioned some of those testing tools, but also then looking at, well, how do we measure the effectiveness of those as well? So in security testing, you have a couple different things. You do have manual inspection. So you have your design threat analysis, and you have your security code reviews, which can be augmented with automated discovery tools as well. But then you have, say, your application, your automated tests for your static code analysis, your dynamic analysis, so that the dynamic runs, the application runs, and then you have a spider that crawls through the interfaces for the services and the user interfaces as well, looking for vulnerabilities. And then you have open source application analysis programs as well, looking for vulnerabilities in third-party or open source components that are used within the code. So the data sources where you can find vulnerabilities reported by each one of those are, again, from the manual testing. You can check your project management ticketing system, looking for tasks that were done and completed. In your automation type tools, looking at those within your pipeline, then you want to look at the logs to see were they accomplished and what the results were. Looking at then, okay, we have the data, so now what about the metrics? What do we do with the metrics on those? First one is usage of each one of those tools or methods. And for those, you want to report a percentage of the production releases that were performed using a particular tool. So is it all of your releases? They all have one of these type of tests? Or is it only a certain percentage? Also, the effectiveness of those tools. So that can be measured by the number of bugs that are created into the backlog. And in the bugs there that you're looking for is the automated tools and even the manual methods. There will be false positives. They appear to be an issue, but maybe it's determined upon subsequent inspection of that it's not a vulnerability after all. So you always want to take the tests that you do. You have a number of discovered items, detections, and then you want to remove from that any that are the false positives. For any remaining, you want to then create bugs for each one of those. So in your bug tracking system, then you're going to have your security bugs, and that's what you're going to use for your metrics. You can also then calculate the cost savings value of detecting these earlier versus when they were discovered, say, by a pen test. So you look at that shift left value in the product development lifecycle, and so you can assign a number there. So you do some analysis to figure out what that would be in your organization. Maybe that's, say, $1,000, right? So then you have the number of detections for a particular test methodology, and you can show what its cost savings were that it contributed because it found it before it was released into the wild or found by others. The other thing is you want to be able to count how many of those vulnerabilities were not remediated in time for the production release. So ideally you would remediate everything before you release, but There may be ones where the team doesn't have time, and so they deploy the code with a particular number of security vulnerabilities, bugs in them, and you want to count those. So they were not fixed. Now, when you do your reporting, some important information to build confidence in the people reading that information is make sure you include information about what was excluded. So maybe not all of the software pipelines used by an organization have these tools or is being monitored. So specify which pipelines. Maybe there are certain kinds of languages, file types that a automated tool cannot scan or that you're not scanning. Maybe some of the file size due to performance issues are being excluded. Whatever those exclusions are, include that information in the footnotes, if you will, or notes on the side as to what is being excluded so that when people review the data, they have that confidence in what they're reviewing. The other thing about these particular tools is you can set the sensitivity levels. So you can either choose all kinds of vulnerabilities that it's going to search for, or is it maybe going to just grab a subset? Maybe all criticals in the OWASP top 10 is a quick example. So that's going to give you a different result than if you said, no, I want to find all vulnerabilities. So just specify what level of sensitivity is being used for these tests. Oh, the other key part about making sure that you're measuring out of the security bugs that are created by your bug tracking system is that is what then goes into the team's backlogs. So that way, not only are you capturing the detection or the vulnerability itself, but you're also ensuring that the team has that into their project plan overall, either to be remediated prior to the release or as part of some other project to remediate it by another team, or maybe some subsequent release that you have. Also, within organizations, you're going to have some group that provides consulting services to the development team, some specialists with security knowledge. So what are some metrics that you can use around consulting type practices? So one of those that was mentioned earlier here was the design threat assessments. So in those, you would want to count, well, how many releases had these? Had a threat assessment done by one of your security consultants. Then you also want to count how many security requirements then were discovered as part of that analysis that were added then to the project backlog. So this then shows these were things that the development team on their own missed. And so you can then infer that, well, okay, that's kind of a value add here by having that SME. They identified these additional security requirements that were necessary. The other thing that you can look at is the cost savings from that. So if that security requirement had not been detected at that point and was later on found to be an issue, and then you have to go back and rework that design and that code, then what is that cost? So maybe that number is, say, $3,000. Whatever an average is within your SSDLC definition, you can do some financial analysis to come up with some averages that you can apply for your projects. And then that way you're putting these particular vulnerabilities into a financial term. The other aspect is the value add of that tool or that method itself, which is avoiding the risk. So the risk itself is something that you want your governance, risk, and compliance department to calculate for each application. So what would be a security incident response cost to the organization for a release? And so that may be caused by one vulnerability. And as we all know, the attackers will chain together some high, mediums, and lows, right, to get their response. So instead, just focus really on, well, what happens if it becomes a security incident and we had a particular overlooked security requirement? What would that impact be? So maybe the answer on that one is an average of, say, $10,000. It's going to be a lot more. Then you have other aspects of the secure software development lifecycle where the teams are engaged, helping them develop the software or engaging with the process overall, what they need to do. There's training. So here you want to measure things like, well, how many teams were supported by that, by the staff of your application security teams. And then how many hours, or you can use story points for that, of those members in providing that as a service. So you can then multiply your story points or your hours by some staff costs per hour as an example to show the value add of that team to the overall development efforts for that application. The data sources for this are primarily, we're talking about manual engagements here. And so again, your project management tracking system here is going to be ones where you either have Jira tasks or maybe you have things like stories for requirements and feature functionalities that need to be built out, non-functional security requirements. So you can count those out of those systems. Then about training engagements as well. So you want to look at, there's two parts of training. There's about the secure software development lifecycle, making sure everyone's aware of what should be done when from a security perspective to be the most efficient for a release. And also then what are some methods on securing the application itself. So secure coding best practices, if you will, and compliance. So for the individuals that you're training on those, you maybe want to count the number of people that are trained, and that can be by different categories. So number of programmers, number of testers, project managers, delivery managers, those type of engagements. And then overall as well for the organization answer, because let's say you have a number of 100. Well, what does 100 mean within the organization? If you had 987 programmers. So you'll want to put that in terms of not just the raw number of people that are trained, but then what percentage do we seem to have? And you're going to want to look at the producers, the frontline workers, the ones creating the artifacts in the applications. Also maybe the management level, first level managers, and then the second plus for executive management as well, because it's a shared, security is a shared responsibility. We're also making sure that the stakeholders and the sponsors and the owners who have accountability for this are also trained in the expectations so that they understand what it is that the organization is trying to achieve, along with the financial commitments that are needed from an investment perspective. Within the development teams, we want to count how many of those teams where did we have at least, say, one trained programmer. You could choose others. You could change that number, but whatever it is, how many teams do you have that kind of meet your minimum goal criteria? And then again, the percentage of the teams that have met that particular goal. And when you look at your reporting train, your performance of your training program overall, look at, well, how effective has that been? Now, one way you can look at it is you can look at the penetration findings, and that'll be a combination of not only the training, but also the testing tools that you're using. So it's a little bit of a wash there is what you're really looking at. So that's where I kind of call it analysis. You're going to get these metrics, then you can combine together and look at, are we able to reduce a certain category of vulnerabilities that we're seeing in our penetration test findings or being reported by others? And how many of the vulnerabilities that we know about during the development phase are actually present then in our production code so that we can analyze them in different ways? And what is our compliance with our secure software development lifecycle? The other thing that we want to do is measure only current staff. So you're going to have people that leave the organization, new people that join. So your percentage will vary, and you don't want to be counting the number of people that are, maybe they were trained, I don't know, beginning of the year, and they're gone at the end of the year. You want to have current status. And you also then want to show those trends. That's fine as well. You also want to look at how many of those certifications, if you have a different kind of program like a Security Ninja or Champions or whatever you want to call your particular security program, how many people have gone through that training and then are renewed on a regular basis because your framework, your tools, your processes change over time. So you want to be able to demonstrate those. How many are current? So the data sources that you can use for this, again, are your manual project management ticket system. And then also you have the learning management system for any kind of training that you have recorded, and also providing your certificates management process. In the pipeline metrics, so Google Dora has also put together a list of key metrics. They do a survey every few years, and they look at, well, what are the key metrics that are being used for DevOps, and what are some indications of leading organizations? What are the key metrics that they use? We can use that as a framework then and look at it from the lens of security as well to provide the corresponding security metrics that we're interested in. So in these metrics, you're going to be getting those out of your pipeline release orchestration system, such as Jenkins, looking at those logs. So going through some of the metrics here, one is the failed deployment rate. So these would be any releases that you decided as an organization that you're going to have something in the pipeline that's going to block a release if it's non-compliant with your secure software development lifecycle process overall. So capture that. The next one would be the lead time for changes. Now, this one should be measured from initial code commit to it running in production. Now, this one isn't related necessarily or purely for security, but we need that data in security to find out what impact the security processes and the tools are having on this particular metric. So this is one that you will want to include as part of your analysis. The defect escape rate. So that normally in DevOps world has to do with how many quality is the quality measure, and security is just part of quality overall. Here we're looking at security bugs that have been released into production. And then from there, we'll want to analyze those based on the severity, maybe the types, things like that as well. Defect volume. So here again, we're measuring the security bugs that are going to be released into production, the overall count, right? We want to see what kind of counts we have. But there we want to then take that and adjust it as well to show what is the financial risk. So doing our calculation with what is the impact to the organization from those going through, so that we have a financial number that isn't just a quantitative number that may not mean something to somebody. And then we have the service level agreement compliance, which in this case, the customer compliance component is going to be the security department. So in here, looking at the whether or not the full SSDLC was followed or not. Oh, sorry. And I was talking about the customer ticketing volume. It's kind of related to that other one here, but here you're looking at where you have the penetration testers as our kind of user acceptance testing from a customer perspective. We're looking at that. So we want to find out how many vulnerabilities did they find. These are their findings, and then by their severity, and these are considered as part of our customer ticketing volume. So just another a side mention here for DevOps security. So when you look at the DevOps pipeline as a whole, you should also treat that as one of your applications, because this is a potential vector for malicious actors to exploit it with injecting malicious code or being able to access sensitive information. So in this one here, the same controls that you apply to preventing misuse apply in here. So you want to look at what are the settings and also the configuration files. So for this configuration files and things like that, where you have a change, you want to have a security review done for that. For the build and release actions as well, you want to ensure that you have your separation of duties controls. And then you may want to then take and have your own customized static code analysis to look for compliance with those policies or what is within the sensitive information within the code. So that would kind of come from when you do a threat analysis of your pipeline and all of its various components, identifying what those vulnerable areas are, and then make sure that you have automated testing to go along with that, and reporting then not only the status but also alerting. So with all these different kind of metrics, next part is where to start. And the good old adage there, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, definitely applies. So important thing to always remember is don't get overwhelmed and try to implement all those metrics at once, right? Those were just a starting baseline set of metrics, and you'll find that you'll want to get more granular and based on your organization's interests, create other ones. So, but the main important thing is just start with what you know, what data you have, and then you can, as you report on these, you'll be able to prioritize them, and then also divide and conquer. Again, dividing the work with other teams that have an interest in this information, and being able to deliver then on these metrics and these performance indications. Another very important part is don't get stuck on the analysis paralysis, especially for the financial estimates. Just go ahead and spend 60 seconds. I had some numbers of 1,000, 3,000, 10,000. They're just off the top of my head, right? Just put them down. Then as you review this and people are able to see these things in terms of financials, they'll be able to ask questions about it. And what you're doing there is that then you are going to, in parallel with this, work with other stakeholders to get to better information for your organization once those become available. Now, for organizational responsibility and accountability, it's very important that you identify this and document it, because we need to ensure that everybody within the organization from the top down is all on the same page with regards to the objectives and the performance indicators. So one of the ways to start would be start with asking, well, who does the board of directors hold accountable for the quality of the production products? It's not just the security team who audits them, if you will, and provides input. It's also the delivery teams, and what are those organizations in the organization chart? So how does that all map together? Who is responsible for hardening initiatives, and then also the funding of those? A tool that can be used in there is a RACIC diagram. So there are different acronyms that can be used for this, RACI as well. I like RACIC. You get the idea. Pick whichever other model you like. But this would be a list of your different applications or initiatives, security initiatives. And you want to identify for those, who is responsible for the delivery of that. So who's actually going to work on it. Then the accountability. What's the management team that has the authority and that is sponsoring that particular work? Who are the supporting teams that are needed to support that effort as well? And then who needs to be informed? These are the people that need to make input into what's being measured and are also interested in the overall status. But those are people who are not necessarily responsible for doing the work itself. And then who also needs to be consulted? The influencers. So these are individuals that will provide input, and they also help define the acceptance criteria for those. So a word about risk overall is the terms risk and risk assessments. They're not intrinsically understood by most people or universally understood. So the management team isn't always exactly sure, and staff, so the general management I'm talking about here, what these different categories mean. We have within the security team the idea about red, orange, yellow, green, right? What's our risk level? It could come from threat level 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever kind of methods that we wanted to use. But from a management perspective overall, the real question is, well, what's the potential business impact. That's what they're really looking for. If they aren't able to really intrinsically understand what that means to their business, then they aren't sure what that really exactly means, and they'll just assume that, well, that somebody else is working on that and that's their problem instead. Within security, information security professionals, also the term risk and risk assessments have different meanings based on what people have read or what sources they're reviewing and what their experience has been in different organizations. But those things are practiced differently by different organizations. Even within an organization, you may have some sub-teams and things like that that implement those in different ways. Most of the literature, if you will, around risk assessments and risk and all that from an application security perspective, those were all based on very high governance type waterfall projects. But unfortunately, they don't scale well to where you have agile, continuous development and release type integration projects. So where you're going to have multiple releases per week, per product and component, and it's not always well understood in, say, months in advance notice of what those feature functionalities are going to be released. Each one of those processes, as they're defined, require people to be trained in the risk analysis computational tools and methods. And again, very difficult to scale at that point. So instead, what I suggest is using the term financial risk exposure, which would be a financial number, so in dollars or euros, that the business understands from an accounting perspective of what the potential exposure would be. What are the financial reserves that would need to be set aside for insurance or some other kind of transference type response to a vulnerability not being remediated? So what is that impact to the financials? So how that could be computed? The GRC department can use their risk analysis for each of the applications, looking at it in context with what security controls are in place for your network and your deployed environments, to determine what kind of potential risk, what the cost of an exposure may be. And then they can even come up with some subcategories about, well, what happens if it was, say, a low severity or a high, that can then be applied to the different vulnerabilities that we discovered earlier that we talked about, that can then be used to aggregate and come up with a number for an application or a department or the organization as a whole. Now, in the use of these outside of just the metrics and the dashboards that we want to create and have available for these, they should also be included along with the project status metrics as well. So they will have, as part of a regular project, what their progress is, what features have been delivered, whether or not it's on time or not, and all those other things. But we also want to have in there, well, what is the financial risk, maybe for the items that are being deferred to be released later or not being planned by the project overall. So by including the financial risk exposure number in those status reports, then that helps develop out business cases to perform further evaluation and also remediate those in maybe subsequent projects or receive additional funding that may need to be required to deliver that as a secure application as part of the project. And finally, on the reporting, we want this information to be available to everybody, right? So again, not a once a month kind of, we have to wait for a particular individual to provide a report. Instead, you want to have a wiki page or internal intranet site page that's accessible 24/7 with the most current data always available to any owner or stakeholder within the organization. You'll want to use an enterprise reporting tool that can aggregate data from multiple sources. So we have some things that are going to come out of our project management tools. We're going to have some out of maybe our maybe a separate bug tracking system. You're going to have some others in maybe your compliance department. And you have your DevSecOps pipeline as well. So how do you aggregate that various data sources together to provide that roll-up? Then you want to have the ability to drill down. So you want to be able to look at the product or the application and then drill down maybe by the different components. And then within the organization itself, right? What's the ownership tree so that you can identify who is responsible and able to address fixing any issues. Also, you want to have filtering for analytic insights. So that's where the vulnerability, having not only the number, but also the severity and the financial risk exposure. We talked about the categories, right? Those are all key parts that you want to have as part of that. You could drill down for insights into what's going on, as well as things like the costs. We talked about some of these things have a financial cost associated with them that may be totally acceptable because it's a part baseline for doing business, but also some of these are providing cost savings and that whole risk reduction. So how do you drill down on insights into those components as well? When you're doing these reports, include footnotes or notes somewhere that makes it clear as well about what is not known. So on your scales, again, use 100% for the whole organization. It's okay to say, well, we don't know for 50% or whatever the percentage is for the organization what that is. That builds that confidence. And then also on what is being excluded and what is the sensitivity of the results that are being provided. That helps identify things like enhancement needs within the organization. Now, for the graphs themselves, it's very useful to show information as far as a 12-month series and then compare it to the previous 12 months. So that way you can look at seasonal variations. Maybe there are summertime lulls or end-of-year lulls, things like that. That would indicate, if you were to just look at the data by itself, you could say, well, it's trending up or it's trending down. Yes. Is that really due to our efforts, or is that due to part of the volume overall of the organization? We maybe are not under as much pressure, those kind of things. And the other thing is to use then stacked histograms that can show, say, the low, medium, and highs all together aggregated. That provides further information into the data points that are being mapped. So with that, again, a quick introduction of baseline metrics. I hope you found this interesting or helpful in some way. This is available on SlideShare as well as on YouTube in the AppSec and DevSecOps channel. So please like and subscribe. If you are interested in receiving a news roundup of things that are happening in the industry that are around these different topics, you can send an email to subscribe@redbit7, as well as I have information there about upcoming new presentations or changes to previous presentations. I know in this one, for instance, I'd like to update it to include some pictures. It would be a little helpful to people understand how these things would look in the reports. So maybe that'll come up here later in the year or at some point in the future. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.